This is the WAIZOWL OGM Pro V2, a full refresh of WAIZOWL's first mouse, the OGM Pro, with a complete spec overhaul, including the long-awaited upgrade to the Pixar 3950, an updated coating, some small shape adjustments, as well as support for 8K wireless polling. As we've seen with all of WAIZOWL's previous mice, the overall quality and performance here on the OGM Pro V2 is fantastic, but the mouse's shape is rather unique, so there are some small quirks with this mouse, but we're going to talk all about those quirks and much more in today's episode of the mel0n Review. Big thank you to Lethal Gaming Gear, who was kind enough to send over the OGM Pro V2 for review, and as a reminder, this video will be fully subtitled and timestamps will be available down in the video description. But without further ado, let's get right into today's episode of the mel0n Review. Now, in regards to testing time, I tested the Pro V2 for about 3 weeks, daily driving the mouse for both work and gaming. For skates, I briefly used the included stock skates, but ended up swapping them out for the extra pad Obsidian Air Dots and Donuts for the majority of my testing. And for pads, I used the Lock-On Harut, the Focus Ambition, the Kurosan Samurai, and the Lethal Gaming Gear Saturn Pro Firm. Alright, now when it comes to performance, across the board the Pro V2 was a fantastic mouse, arguably one of the best performing mice I've tried in 2024. It's sadly not to the level of the OP1AK in terms of raw performance, as it lacks that endgame gear X factor, but it's still a very well performing mouse, enough for it to be in my top 5 of 2024 so far. The Pro V2 shape, despite being rather unique, is an extremely comfortable shape that naturally fit my hands like a glove. I didn't expect the shape to be so comfortable given how unique it is, but it feels fantastic even for larger handed folk like myself. The mouse's coating is also a standout, being one of the best coatings I've tried this year. The coating is so good it's actually tied with the OP1AK's coating for the best coating I've used this year. And like we've seen on all the previous WAIZOWL mice, the overall performance was fantastic, specifically when it came to the implementation of the 3950 sensor, which is extremely well done. It's actually the best 3950 implementation I've seen from a non-Razer mouse to date, which is very impressive. Now, one very unique thing about the Pro V2 I noticed during my testing is that I always had this very locked-in feeling when I was using the mouse. This is something I haven't felt since I tested the OP1 8K, but on that mouse the locked-in feeling was caused by that endgame gear X factor I mentioned earlier, but here on the Pro 2, I wasn't able to really define why I had this locked-in feeling. Normally when I review a mouse, I'm always very conscious that I'm holding a different mouse from what I normally use, and this often continues weeks into testing, but I never had that feeling here on the Pro V2, as it just felt natural, for lack of a better word, in my hand. And this natural locked-in feeling I got here on the Pro V2, combined with the fantastic performance, the amazing 3950 sensor implementation, made the Pro V2 an extremely well-rounded and stellarly performing mouse, so much so that, as I mentioned earlier, it's locked in a spot in my top 5 of 2024. Next up, let's talk about the Pro V2's unboxing experience and included accessories, as there has been a lot of improvements in this area coming from WAIZOWL's previous mice. The first improvement you'll see is that the mouse's packaging has been updated. This newer packaging is not only visually more eye-catching than the old packaging we saw on WAIZOWL's other mice, it's also much easier to open than the OGM's cloud packaging was. Opening the box, the first thing we see is the OGM Pro V2 itself. Under the mouse we have an 8K polling dongle that is the same design as the 4K polling dongle we saw included with the OGM Cloud. Also included is a standard USB A to C cable. Funnily enough, just like the dongle, this is also the same cable we saw included with the OGM Cloud. And keeping in theme of similarities to the OGM Cloud, the Pro V2 comes with the same grip tape we saw included with the Cloud, which I'm very happy to see, as these stock grips are some of my favorite grips out there. We also have a full paper user manual included, which I'm very happy to see, and lastly there are the included stock skates. There are actually 3 different versions included: a full-size control set, a speed set, and a set of 10 dot skates. Now you might have noticed that the V2 Pro doesn't have any skates pre-installed on it out of the box, and there's actually a very good reason for this, but we're going to talk about why this is, as well as more in depth about the included cable, grips, and stock skates later on in this video. Now in regards to build quality and QC, just like we've seen on all of WAIZOWL's previous products, the overall build quality and QC here on the Pro V2 is exceptional. Out of the box, the mouse doesn't have any flexing or creaking anywhere on the shell, and over my testing the mouse didn't develop any issue areas, as expected for a WAIZOWL mouse. One really great attention to detail that WAIZOWL has done here is they've added these little QC verification stickers onto the mouse and the 8K dongle. Now I personally really like that they've done this, but I do have a small criticism in regards to where the stickers were placed. One sticker was placed on the bottom rubber base of the 8K polling dongle, which was fine, but the other sticker was placed right under my left click on the front of the mouse's shell, not in the most visually visually appealing place. So while I'm happy to see QC stickers here, the positioning could be improved. I'd much rather see these stickers installed on the mouse's base or inside one of the skate cutouts rather than on the front of the shell. As I mentioned earlier, the cable that comes with the OGM Pro V2 is the same cable we saw included with the OGM Cloud. This is unfortunately a bit of a miss here from WAIZOWL, as the Cloud stock cable was pretty underwhelming, and seeing the exact same cable here on the Pro V2 without any improvements made to it is rather disappointing. The cable itself is the same black USB A to C cable that has a non-tilted USB-C end. It also has a very rough paracord wrapping that is very high friction against some rougher surfaced mouse pads. The cable is also surprisingly rigid and lacks that flexibility you'd expect from a stock cable. On the plus side though, the cable is thin enough to be used with mouse sponges, which eliminates the friction issues with the cable's rougher outer paracord wrapping, but the rigidity of the cable still hampers the wired experience quite heavily even when used with a bungee. Seeing as the Pro V2 only supports 1K pulling over wired connectivity, the stock cable will likely only be used for charging, but this doesn't excuse the poor cable design here, as we've seen other mice like the Pulsar X2 series that also only support a 1K pulling over their wired connectivity include cables that are not only more flexible, they also had a smoother paracord wrapping and a tilted USB-C end. I would love to see WAIZOWL upgrade their stock cables for their future launches, especially considering that their future mice will likely support high pulling rates over the wired connectivity. If WAIZOWL were to upgrade their stock cables to one that is similar to the Pulsar stock cables, that would be a massive improvement over the current stock cable and would make the wired usage on WAIZOWL's mice significantly better than it currently is. As I mentioned earlier in the unboxing segment of this video, the Pro V2 doesn't come with any skates pre-installed, which seems odd compared to the other mice on the market, but WAIZOWL did this intentionally for a couple of reasons. Since the V2 Pro comes with 3 types of stock skates, a full-size control set, a speed set, and a set of 10 dot skates, having no skates pre-installed on the mouse allows the user to pick and choose what type of stock skates they want to use, or install their preferred aftermarket skates right out of the box without having to go through the hassle of removing any pre-installed skates. This also has the added benefit of not creating additional e-waste, as there are no pre-installed skates that will just be tossed away without being used. Now, the stock skates themselves are 100% PTFE, but they're the same weird filled PTFE skates we found on the Vancer mice that are dual layered, having an outer softer PTFE layer and a middle hardened PTFE layer that acts as a filling to prevent the skates from collapsing over use. Now, my experience with this skate type in particular has been pretty negative, as they're very controlled and much slower than the traditional harder 100% PTFE stock skate you commonly see. So I dislike this type of skate, but I also dislike most stock skates due to their unbalanced surface area, so this isn't exactly surprising. But unlike me, most people will be perfectly happy with the included stock skates here, especially people who use stock skates all the time. Just keep in mind that these skates will be slower and more controlled than more traditional stock skates, and be sure to remove the blue protective film over the stock skates before you use them. Now, for my testing, I briefly tested the included stock skates, but I ended up quickly swapping them out in favor of the Extra Pad Obsidian Air Dots and Air Donut skates, as those skates perform better and were balanced in terms of their surface area. Another area where there has been significant improvement coming from the OGM Pro V1 is weight. The first OGM Pro weighed in around 68 grams with a plus-minus gram ratio of 2 grams, while the OGM Pro V2 is advertised as weighing in at a much lighter 49 grams with the same plus-minus gram ratio. Now, weighing in my Pro V2 with no stock skates installed, my unit is weighing in around 51.19 grams, 0.19 grams over the advertised weight spec. This is including the full plus-minus 2 gram ratio. So while the Pro V2 is lighter than the Pro V1, there's a little more than meets the eye here, because the Pro V2's weight I measured here does not include the weight of the stock skates. Adding the skates into the equation, the full-size stock skate set will increase the Pro V2's weight by around 2.6 grams, the speed stocks will increase the weight by around 1.2 grams, and the dot skates, assuming you use all 10, will bump the weight by an additional 0.6 grams. So in reality, the Pro V2's true weight will range anywhere from 52.24 grams to 53.79 grams, depending on what version of the stock skates you use, which is well outside the advertised 49 gram weight, even including its plus-minus 2 gram ratio. This also means that WAIZOWL's claim that the Pro V2 is 28% lighter than the Pro V1 is inaccurate, as in actuality it's only 23% to 26% lighter, again depending on what sets of skates you use. Now, this isn't necessarily new. We've seen many other mice have pretty inaccurate weight specs before, but the advertised weight here for the Pro V2 versus the true weight of the mouse is far too different for me to give WAIZOWL a pass here. I would strongly suggest that WAIZOWL update their marketing to better reflect the true weight of the Pro V2. I think if they advertised the mouse to weigh 51 grams with a plus-minus 2 gram ratio, it'd not only better reflect the true weight of the mouse, it would also account for the added weight from the stock skates. As I mentioned at the top of this video, the Pro V2 has a very unique shape, so let's talk about that a little more next. The Pro V2 shape is a right-handed ergo shape that measures 120 by 57 by 40 millimeters, but unlike a true ergo mouse like the Sprime PM1 or Death Adder V3, both of which have very aggressively tilted shells, the Pro V2 shell is tilted, but it's very slight, the slightest I've ever seen on an ergo mouse. Because of this, while on paper the Pro V2 is categorized as an ergo mouse, in the hand it feels much more akin to an ergo-symmetrical hybrid or an asymmetrical mouse like the Keychron M2 for example, rather than a true ergo. This is what makes the Pro V2 unique, as its shape is a very different take on an ergo design. The mouse is still incredibly comfortable for my hands as I mentioned earlier, but it's not going to feel like you'd expect an ergo mouse to feel like, despite its ergo classification. Now in terms of the Pro V2 shell profile and shape characteristics, looking at the Pro V2 from the top, you can see its tall ergo-like shape with its exaggerated flare towards the right of the mouse and the smaller flare towards the left of the mouse. WAIZOWL has actually changed the right side flare here on the Pro V2, as the right side flare on the Pro V1 was very aggressive, and that's been reduced here on the Pro V2 to make the shape a little more comfortable. Flipping the unit over, you can better see the Pro V2's unique shaping. When compared to the PM1 of the Death Adder V3, you can see why this mouse doesn't feel like an ergo mouse, as the shape is more akin to the asymmetrical shape of the Keychron M2, not the aforementioned ergo mice. Looking at the shell from the side, you can see the hump profile of the mouse is centrally focused, similar to the hump profile of the Ponage Stormbreaker, just less pronounced at the peak of the shell, and that the shell's curvature is more aggressive towards the rear of the mouse than it is at the front, typical for most ergo mice. Looking at the mouse from the front, you can clearly see the shell's slight tilt that I mentioned earlier. You can also see that the side of the Pro V2 shell are mostly flat and tilt outwards at around an 87-degree angle. And lastly, looking from the rear, we can see the hump's profile, which is a wider, semi-flattened design, but unlike an asymmetrical mouse's rear hump where both sides would be even, because the Pro V2 is still an ergo, you can see that the left side of the hump is taller than the right, but since the shell is only slightly tilted, the height difference between the left and the right sides is very slight, significantly less than what you'd see on a true ergo mouse. Due to the Pro V2's unique ergo-like shape, the contact areas for this mouse are going to be quite different from what you'd find on a more traditional ergo mouse. For my 19.05 by 12.7 centimeter hands using a claw grip, my contact areas were balanced between my mid to low thenar, mid-high palm, and mid-thenar. This is to be expected given the Pro V2's hump curvature being a wider profile, as these hump designs often have very balanced contact areas. On not so giant hands, the mouse's contact areas will likely be less balanced and more reliant on mid-palm contact than thenar or hypothenar, but this will vary from hand to hand. In terms of grip compatibility here for the Pro V2, WAIZOWL's advertising of this mouse will be best suited for small to medium hands with palm grips, and for large hands it'll be best suited with claw grips. From my testing, WAIZOWL's advertised grip compatibility here is pretty much spot on. I myself use a claw grip and the mouse was perfect for that grip style, and for smaller hands the mouse will be perfect for palm grips. Now to be fully transparent, I did end up using the Soul Spacer Shapeshift grips during my testing to help with anchoring my thumb and ring finger on the sides of the mouse, but I only needed to do this because I have such large hands. On hand sizes much smaller than mine, you'll be able to grip the Pro V2 without the need for any kind of external grip aid, as the mouse's coating is exceptional, so let's talk about that next. Now historically speaking, WAIZOWL mice have always had god tier coatings, like the coatings we saw in the OGM Cloud, but somehow WAIZOWL managed to outdo themselves here, as the coating here on the Pro V2 is significantly better than the coating we saw in the OGM Cloud. Now the OGM Cloud was using WAIZOWL's Gen 2 feather-light coating, which felt like a hybrid between a matte and chalky coating, but the Pro V2 is using the upgraded Gen 3 feather coating, which feels much chalkier to the hand, very similar to the feeling of the Endgame Gear OP1AK's coating. So unsurprisingly, given the coating's similarity to the OP1AK's coating, coating, the Pro V2's Gen 3 feather coating performed exceptionally well, even for people with sweatier hands like myself. The coating is still usable with dry hands of course, but it's best for sweatier hands, as the coating is the grippiest when it's exposed to a little bit of moisture. And even with my extremely sweaty hands, the Pro V2's coating maintained its grippiness, and I never ran into any situations where I felt like I couldn't properly grip the mouse, or where I felt like I needed to re-anchor my grip, regardless of how sweaty my hands got during use. But while WAIZOWL's Gen 3 feather coating does perform exceptionally well, it does have the same flaw that all great coatings have, where it attracts fingerprints, dust, dirt, and oils from your hand like a magnet does metal. Thankfully, the mouse's shell is very easy to clean, as you can just wipe it off with a microfiber cloth to remove any debris or fingerprints, but unless you do this very frequently, your mouse will always be covered in fingerprints since the coating picks up literally everything so well. Now, personally speaking, I don't really mind this, as I use a lot of mice with very similar coatings, so I'm very used to this grimy look on my mice. But if you're picky about your mouse looking clean all the time and you dislike seeing fingerprints on your mouse, I don't recommend getting the black colorway of the Pro V2. Instead, I'd recommend getting the red, pink, or sky fade colorways, as those versions will have lighter shells, so anything that the coating picks up will be much less visible on those versions. Now, if you aren't a fan of the chalky coating here on the Pro V2, rest assured WAIZOWL has included some fantastic grip tape here with the mouse, so let's talk about that next. The Pro V2's included grips, as I mentioned earlier in this video, are the same type we saw included with the OGM Cloud, but unlike the stock cable, I'm very happy to see the same grips here with this mouse, as these are some of the best included grips out there. Now, the grips that come with the Pro V2 are a pre-cut full-size set, including 2 side covers, 2 click covers. The set doesn't come with any side button covers, but instead it comes with an additional crescent-shaped piece. Then you can use this to apply it to the rear of the mouse's shell to help better anchor your upper or lower mid palm, as well as your thenar or hypothenar. Now, WAIZOWL's grips are on the thicker side, which some people won't like, but the thicker material does make the grips very durable, but they're not so thick where it's easy to crease or warp the grips when installing them or removing them, which is great to see. The stock grips themselves are made out of a harder material, so you can't press into the grips like you can on other thicker grip tapes, but despite this, the stock grips are still very grippy, as the material has that natural stickiness we saw in the X-Ray Pad Gecko 2.0 and Cicada Wing grips, but the WAIZOWL stock grips have the added benefit of having a unique ice crystal-like fractal-like texturing to them that further increases their gripability. And because of the stock grips' natural stickiness and their unique texturing, the stock grips performed amazingly and are great for both wet and dry hands, and over my testing, the grips never lost any of their natural stickiness, just like we saw with the OGM Cloud stock grips. The only problem I can see people having with the stock grips here, as I mentioned earlier, is that they are on the thicker side, and the texturing might not be everyone's cup of tea. If that's the case for you and you do want to use grip tape here on the Pro V2, I'd recommend getting the X-Ray Pad Cicada Wing 2.0s, as they're thinner than the included grips but have a similar level of gripability, just without the texturing. Alright, next up let's talk about the Pro V2's main clicks. The shell buttons are larger buttons, similar to the OGM Cloud's main buttons, just shorter in length with a more pronounced curvature to them. And due to the slight tilt in the V2 Pro's shell, the main clicks are ever so slightly tilted, again much less than you see on a true ergo shape, but still tilted nonetheless. The shell buttons don't have any finger grooves or indentations in them, but they do share the same coating as the rest of the Pro V2's shell, so the fantastic coating makes the shell buttons very grippable, and it's very easy to keep your fingers anchored on the shell buttons during use. In terms of audio feedback, I'll give you a quick little sound test here. Inside, the Pro V2 is using the Wano blue shell pink dot switches, the same switches we saw on the OGM Cloud's main buttons. The Pro V2's main clicks have a fairly average actuation weight, feeling around a 4 out of 10. They also have a small to medium range of pre and post travel, and both the left and right buttons feel the same in terms of pre and post travel and click feeling as well. The main clicks also have a great rebound, so despite the longer pre and post travel, the buttons still feel snappy and spammable, and both shell buttons are extremely well stabilized with little to no play on either button. Another nice attention to detail here on the Pro V2 is that the main clicks are indented into the shell, just like they were on the OGM Cloud, so the main clicks are immune to any interference issues that would be caused by your fingers resting on the sides of the mouse's shell, which is a great thing to see. Next, let's talk about the Pro V2's side buttons. The side buttons are shaped in a large, flattened, dagger-like shape, very similar in shape to the Death Adder V3 side buttons, just with a much slighter curvature to them. The side buttons are installed fairly high up in the mouse's side shell, and they're ever so slightly forwardly tilted to match the overall curvature of the shell. They're also installed about 3mm forward of the mouse's midline. And just like the Pro V2's main clicks, the side buttons also share the same coating as the rest of the shell, so they're very grippy, and combined with the larger, flatter design and shaping, as well as their positioning, both the side buttons are very easy to reach and consistently actuate, even for myself with my larger hands. In terms of side click audio feedback, I'll give you a quick little sound test here. Inside, the Pro V2 uses a rather unique side button switch. Instead of using the WAZOWL black shell white dot switches that we've seen for almost every mouse's side buttons this year, the Pro V2 is using a kale blue bottom green dot switch. Now, I've seen one or two mice use kale switches for side buttons this year, but I've never seen or heard of this kale green dot switch or of it ever being used in a mouse until now. Now, while I'm all for trying new side switches, as the WAZOWL white dot switches are very overused, the switch choice here on the Pro V2 isn't the greatest. In terms of click feeling, both the side buttons have a very heavy actuation weight, much heavier than the main clicks, feeling around a 6.5 out of 10. Both the side clicks have a tiny amount of pre-travel and a medium amount of post-travel, and both the side buttons do feel consistent in terms of pre and post-travel and their click feeling, and the side buttons do have a surprisingly good rebound to them that does help keep the side buttons somewhat spammable despite their heavier actuation weight. And just like the main clicks, both the side buttons are extremely well stabilized with little to no play on either side button. So while on paper the side buttons here on the Pro V2 look good, personally speaking the actuation weight is too heavy for my taste, as it reminds me of those extremely heavy side buttons we saw in the first Ponage Stormbreaker, not to the same extent of course, but in the same way where the side buttons kind of stand out in a negative way from the rest of the mouse. In my opinion, side buttons should always be similar to the main clicks in terms of actuation weight, and the ones here on the Pro V2 are just too heavy compared to the main clicks. I would have much rather seen WAIZOWL use the WAZOWL black shell white dot switches here for the Pro V2, as this is the switch they use for the OGM Cloud side buttons, and if you compare the Cloud side buttons to the Pro V2's main clicks, they feel very similar in terms of their post travel as well as their actuation weight. Seeing the WAZOWL white dot switches here on the Pro V2 would be a significant improvement, and it would make the mouse feel more balanced in terms of the mouse's click feeling, and the side switches wouldn't stand out in such a negative way. To be clear though, the side switches here are still totally usable, you just have to get accustomed to their higher actuation weight. Alright, let's talk about scroll wheel next. The Pro V2's scroll wheel is the same scroll wheel we saw on the OGM Cloud, being a rubber ringed wheel with a linear texturing. The rubber texturing is quite soft and very grippy, so it's very easy to scroll and scroll wheel click consistently here on the Pro V2. Inside, the Pro V2 is using a TTC silver 13mm encoder that has a scroll force of about 3.5 out of 10. It's a surprisingly light scroll wheel for a 13mm encoder, but thankfully the encoder has very pronounced scroll points, so while the scroll force is light, it's still controlled by these higher scroll points. These higher scroll points also allow you to consistently scroll wheel click here on the Pro V2 without accidentally scrolling, something you'll often have issues with on lighter scroll wheels with less pronounced scroll points. Speaking of the scroll wheel click, inside the Pro V2 is using a level 3 WAZOWL black shell red dot switch. The switch is similar in height to the scroll wheel switch we saw on the LemoKey G1, just from a different manufacturer. The scroll wheel click has an actuation force of about 4.5 out of 10, slightly higher than the main click's actuation force, but not by a significant margin. Surprisingly though, given that it's a scroll wheel switch, it has a surprisingly good rebound, which is nice to see, as often scroll wheel clicks feel rather mushy. Now before I move on, I wanted to make a note that for some reason on WAIZOWL's website, the spec sheet for the Pro V2 lists the middle click switch as being a WAZOWL black shell white dot switch, not the red dot switch that's inside my Pro V2. I assume this is an error with the spec sheet, as I've never seen a level 3 WAZOWL white dot switch before, but on the off chance this isn't, and the switch was changed during manufacturing, keep in mind that your mouse's middle click actuation force and rebound might slightly change depending on what switch is inside your unit. Now, as I mentioned earlier on in this video, one of the biggest upgrades to the Pro V2 is the update to the Pixart 3950 sensor instead of the 3395s we saw on WAIZOWL's previous mice. Now, just like all the other 3950s we've seen released this year, this one is branded under a custom naming, the Hawkeye V1 in this case, but regardless of its custom naming, this is just a normal Pixart 3950. In terms of positioning, the sensor is centrally positioned in the Pro V2 shell, right at the midline of the mouse. The sensor itself is similar to the other 3950s we've seen released this year, with the same DPI range of 50 to 30,000, but oddly enough there are only two LOD levels here, 1mm and 2mm. Normally there should be a 0.7mm LOD, but it seems to be disabled here on this mouse for some reason. Aside from that oddity, the rest of the sensor is normal, with motion sync, ripple, and angle snapping all enabled on the sensor, and these can be enabled or disabled via the Pro V2 software. And just like the 3395 we saw in the OGM Cloud, the sensor here on the Pro V2 does have a high and low power modes, so you can get a little bit more performance out of your sensor, but only when the mouse is used on 1K Hz. Now, while the Pro V2's 3950 doesn't have the 0.7mm LOD setting, it does have something that I haven't seen on any other 3950 sensors so far, aside from Razor's, where you can enable a tilt feature that digitally tilts the sensor. Now, this feature is designed for people who use angled or tilted grips, as it's supposed to straighten out your movements so they're more consistent, similar in concept to what angle snapping would do, just defined by the user and more consistent on all axes. Now, I'm not going to talk about this feature today, as this feature has a lot of implications in terms of how it's going to change your aim both in the short term and long term, and because of this, I'm going to talk more in depth about this tilt feature in a future video, so be sure to get subscribed so you don't miss that video. But aside from the updated sensor, surprisingly nothing has changed in terms of the Pro V2's MCU, as it's using the same Nordic 52840 MCU we saw the OGM Cloud use. This isn't a bad thing per se, but I am surprised we didn't see an upgrade here. But despite the older MCU, as I mentioned at the top of this video, the sensor implementation here is absolutely fantastic on the Pro V2, and I didn't run into any connectivity or latency issues here over my testing with the Pro V2. Speaking of performance, let's talk about the Pro V2's polling rates next. As I mentioned earlier, the mouse supports up to 8K polling via the 2.4 GHz wireless connectivity, but sadly the mouse only supports 1K polling via wired USB-C connectivity. Now, while I am disappointed not to see any wired high polling rates here on the Pro V2, the wireless polling rates are very well implemented, just like they were on the OGM Cloud. Both the 2 and 4K polling rates are perfectly implemented here on the Pro V2, and their feeling is pretty much 1-to-1 to the 2 and 4K polling rates we saw on the OGM Cloud. Now, sadly, due to the age of my system, I wasn't able to test the 8K polling as it nukes my CPU, so games are unplayable, but the 2 and 4K polling rate performed perfectly well for my testing, as I just mentioned. Now, before I move on, I wanted to make a quick note. The Pro V2 does support Bluetooth connectivity, just like the OGM Cloud did, but this connectivity mode will cap the mouse's report rate to 125 Hz, so you can't utilize any of the high polling rates over that connectivity mode. On the topic of high polling rates, let's talk about battery next. The Pro V2 uses a standard 300 mAh battery. Now, according to WAIZOWL's product page for the Pro V2, they're advertising this mouse will have an estimated battery life of 130 hours, but this battery life was measured while the mouse was being used via Bluetooth, not 2.4 GHz wireless, so in reality, the Pro V2's battery life is going to be much worse than advertised. From my testing, the mouse lasted around 45.3 hours on 1K polling, on 2K polling it lasted 22.5 hours, on 4K polling it lasted 14.5 hours, and on 8K polling the mouse lasted 8.5 hours. Now, keep in mind that the battery life values I just gave you here are measured on constant motion. In reality, the mouse isn't going to be constantly moving, so auto sleep will kick in to prevent unnecessary battery usage, so the actual battery life of the Pro V2 will be much longer depending on your use case. The battery life and optimizations here on the Pro V2 are good, but I do find myself wondering how the mouse would fare if it was using a smaller 250 mAh battery, as yes, that would lower the mouse's overall battery life, but it would shave a few grams off the mouse's weight, bringing it closer to the advertised 49 ±2 gram weight. I also think that WAIZOWL should be updating their marketing for the Pro V2 to better reflect the true battery life of the product, as advertising the mouse to have 130 hours of battery life isn't very representative of the true battery life of the Pro V2. And lastly, let's talk about repairability. Now, WAIZOWL mice have always been very serviceable, and I'm happy to report that that great serviceability continues here on the Pro V2. To open the mouse, all you need to do is remove 5 screws from the base, then you can run your fingernail along the seam between the top and the base shell to disconnect them. And just like we saw in the OGM Cloud, it's very easy to mod or replace the battery. It's also very easy to repair the side buttons as they're on their own PCB. Sadly though, the main buttons aren't hot swappable, so if you want to mod those, you will need to desolder them for yourself, but this is pretty par for the course nowadays. But overall, the Pro V2, just like all the previous WAIZOWL mice, is very easy to service, which is awesome to see. I'm definitely going to mod in a 200 or 250 mAh battery to shave a little bit of weight off my unit, and I'm happy to see that this will be very easy to do so here. If you'd like to see how to mod the battery here on the Pro V2, or just to see how to take apart the mouse to clean it or repair it, be sure to get subscribed as I will have a full teardown for the Pro V2 coming out in a couple days after this review goes live. Alright, well, in closing, overall, I'm quite impressed with what WAIZOWL has cooked up here with the OGM Pro V2. While the mouse does have its flaws in the form of its stock cable, the oddly heavy side buttons, the lack of high polling rates over the wire connectivity, as well as the very inaccurate weight and battery life specs here, the positives of the Pro V2 far outweigh the negatives in my opinion, as the mouse's unique ergo shape is surprisingly really good despite its quirks, and the performance of the mouse is incredibly good too, specifically when it comes to the fantastic 3950 implementation. The coating is also fantastic, and it's one of the best coatings I've used this year, and the included grip tapes are also amazing. And while I personally don't like the stock skates, having 3 versions included is really nice to see. I just wish they weren't those weird filled skates. And as I mentioned earlier in this video, the Pro V2 is the only other mouse I've tested aside from the OP1AK that gave me that locked in feeling when I was using it. So despite the mouse's flaws, the Pro V2 is one of the best feeling and best performing mice I've used in 2024, and it's easily locked in a spot in my top 5 of 2024. Of course, there is still room for improvement here with the OGM Pro V2, but it's still a fantastic mouse across the board. Given the improvements we've seen here from the Pro V2, I'm very excited to see what else WAIZOWL has been cooking up. I know they just released an OGM Cloud V2, which I will be reviewing very soon, and I know they're also working on an OGM Cloud Mini, as well as a true ergo shape, which I'm very interested in checking out. So I'll be keeping a very close eye on what WAIZOWL has been cooking up, and I'll be sure to cover any of their future releases here on the channel. But that's going to be everything for this episode of the mel0n review. Thank you very much again to Lethal Gaming Gear for sending over the WAIZOWL OGM Pro V2 for review. I greatly appreciate it. Big thank you to our channel members Yuki89, Prince, It Was Luck, Lunaris, and Mark World. Your support is greatly appreciated. If you'd like to become a member here and support what I'm doing here on the channel with the in-depth reviews and the teardown project, you can become a member here for only $2 a month. It's one of the best ways to directly support the channel, so thank you very much in advance for your support. You can also support the channel by using code mel0n with a 0 over at Lethal Gaming Gear, Potent Gaming, Mech Keys, TJ Exclusives, and a couple other retailers to save yourself some money on your orders and help directly support the channel. Thank you again for watching my review of the WAIZOWL OGM Pro V2, and I'll catch you all in the next episode of the mel0n review. Peace.